So hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of EDU 383 collaborative transitions practices for students who are differently abled, and welcome. So this week in the text, we really have taken a deep dive into the way that job developers negotiate contracts and negotiate jobs for their students. And we've also looked at, or are looking at in chapter 8, I think it is 7 and 8, we're looking at job carving. And that methodology of job carving is especially significant. We know that because, as the authors point out, there is a real lack of employability for people who are differently abled in the workforce. And through the powers of your observation, your keen assessment and analysis of jobs, as well as the discovery process and person-centered job planning, the potential for bringing a job to a potential employee is I think, pretty good. So let's start with chapter 7 and talk a little bit about what's in this chapter. So I think it's a pretty important chapter for a number of reasons. Of course, as a job developer, as a special educator in schools, thinking about how you're going to negotiate and develop not only jobs, but transition plans, and not only transition plans, but IEPs, and cultivate opportunities for your students in the schools. I think if you think about that process, this particular chapter is really going to be very helpful for you because it outlines a lot of fundamental principles of things like active listening, conflict management, and how to negotiate and advocate for your student in the midst of teachers, potentially, if the student is included, or when the student is included in general education classrooms, that are going to help you across the board. So I think chapter 7 is a really good chapter to focus on specifically, not just from the perspective of understanding job development in the ways of talking to employers, creating conversations, and developing opportunities, working with students' potential, but also because these kinds of skills and the development of these skills are going to be important for you as special educators in schools. You will be doing the same kind of soft skill development and the same kind of conversation and listening that goes on, and should go on, between you and your teachers and the administrators and the other people at your school as you advocate for your students. So there are two basic frames that are at work actually in both these chapters. One is focus on the learner, and the basic frame with the learner is, what can the learner do? What can the learner learn? And what can the learner do with support? So keeping that frame in mind all the time and looking for those opportunities and options as you do person-centered planning and job development for your learner, those are important things to keep in mind. Can do, able to do, and do with support. The other frame is the frame that the business brings into the conversation. So it's important in a job analysis to be able to describe tasks that, if combined, can create efficiency. And that's the idea of the job carving principle. So keep that in mind. And again, good observation, good interviewing skills, ask questions, find out, both on the job and for your IEP meetings and in your schools. So again, these kinds of skills are transferable to any number of situations that you're going to find yourself in. The emphasis on supports, as we're learning and as we see in the 7th chapter and in the 8th chapter, is really on those natural supports that benefit the learner. The key to creating and speaking to employers as well as parents, teachers, administrators, is to maintain relationships. So ultimately, you want to listen carefully and you want to make sure that your relationships are maintained. So that seventh chapter gives you some really good ideas about how to structure conversations, for example. So the idea of assuming that all people mean well, expressing reasons and rationales for meetings, for IEP meetings as well as job developer meetings, to identify what the goals are and what the potential outcomes are, and to understanding how everybody around the table, and an employer and a student in particular, can come to some sort of mutual benefit. So it's really important to just use conversations and to listen well and listen actively. So remember too that in addition to natural supports, there are monetary supports and there are negotiated supports that you can develop with the employer. So now we're talking strictly in the frame of job development. But remember, and we'll learn more about this, there is monetary support available for equipment, for training, for coaching that you could avail your student of and make sure your student has in order to go forward in the transition process. One of the things that really struck me in chapter 8 was the point about jobs being important for integration into the community. And this is why we're starting with the conversation about jobs first. And I'm sort of foregrounding that for you, because in that effort and in that possibility of finding good, fruitful, meaningful employment in a community, there is a more likely outcome of integration and independent living, which we'll talk about at the end, which is also our focus for this week, and looking at how your student can independently live. But being in a community starts with a sense of agency, starts with a sense of fulfillment, and starts with a sense of meaning with a job that your student can enjoy and feel is practicable and meets that person's needs. So these are all things to keep in mind about support. There are several important points in chapter 7 that I think you really want to focus on. One is looking at some of the causes of conflict. So listening very carefully to the conversation, and this is true in any conversation where you're advocating for your student, listening for what the issues are, if there's ever any tension or conflict about something that you want to put in place. So is this about the relationship? Is this about the different values that people have? After all, we know that inclusion is a value that we want to enforce and make positive for our students. So you'll find yourself in that kind of conversation. Recognize when it is a value conflict. Being able to understand whether it's the system or whether it's the individual is also an important thing to analyze when you're talking to other people. Is the problem that there's not enough information about this individual, about the job, about their plan in your school? And how do you harness more data and more information to make that conflict subside? And finally, what are the kind of vested interests in any conversation? Parents in particular always have a vested interest in their child. So being able to ferret some of those out and analyze them a little bit would also be important for you as special educators. So working toward comfort, working toward a positive outlook and a positive environment to have these different conversations in would be very important for you as well. Even a simple thing like providing food or providing some sort of, something to drink, just some bottled water at a meeting is also important for you to think about, for IEP meetings or any meetings you might potentially have with employers or people in the community as you're looking at transition. Active listening is also an important consideration and something that you can practice and you need to develop. The basic idea behind active listening is that you need to validate a perspective. In other words, even if there's criticism leveled at you, recognize that that criticism is also coming from a transmitter. So a person has a particular perspective, and it's never all about you. It's also about that person. But validating and acknowledging that person's point of view is an important consideration, and it's a good first step to minimizing conflict. I understand. Yes, I see what you mean. And sort of absorbing that and hearing that and understanding it at face value objectively. In active listening, it's important to think of yourself sort of on the balcony, listening to the conversation outside the conversation, because what that will enable you to do is minimize the emotion that comes along with things like criticism or anger or displeasure at some decision or at the conversation. So kind of take an objective perspective when it comes to people talking about things, and then you'll be able to reconcile those things a little sooner. But acknowledging and validating is an important first step. Use silences, ask questions, and check in. So make sure that paraphrase what a person has said in a few words or a sentence or two. And then after that paraphrase, move on to kind of the next level, which is to say, is this what I'm hearing? Is what I'm hearing correct? So check in. And if the person says yes, you can move the conversation along to where you want it to be. But acknowledging, validating, using silence, checking in, asking questions, getting a yes when people do indeed say, you understood me, can move you along to some constructive outcomes as a result. There are good questions to ask in terms of avoiding destructive kinds of criticism and conflict in that regard. And again, the check-in is really important when you're managing any kind of conflict and having those conversations. It's also important, as that chapter points out, to continue to have a focus on the person and continue to have a focus on the employer's needs, on the teacher's needs, on the teacher's interests, all of those different reasons for conflict, kind of ferreting them out, and then making sure that your focus is on the individual. So validation and being heard is always important. And finally, the chapter talks about the importance of collaboration and maintaining those relationships. So that's really going to be a critical outcome overall for you as a special education teacher, as well as a job developer. Chapter 8 talks about job carving. I found this chapter to be pretty interesting, in part because it does provide you some really practical means to think about and talk about jobs. But really, fundamentally, what I found kind of amazing and eye-opening, and I'd really encourage you to read it through and think about it from this perspective, is a lot of the case studies, all of the case studies in this particular chapter, and most of this chapter is about case studies, really capture the kind of give and take that goes on between the employer and the person with whom, for whom you're advocating. So the kind of job carving in practice that Chapter 8 deals with, I think, is really remarkable. And those case studies and the successes that these people had, that these people who are differently abled enjoyed in the workforce, are really very instructive. And I think they're inspiring in a lot of ways. It takes a lot of work. Now, for you as special educators, you may not be doing this work directly, but knowing about this work, being able to talk the language of a job carve with an Access VR representative or with someone from the community as you're looking at developing transition for your students can really, really be beneficial. So take a look at Chapter 8, focus on those case studies, look at the different ways that job developers were able to convince potential employers, again, of pieces of jobs becoming one job in the interest of efficiency. And that's really the frame with which you, as a potential job developer, certainly as a special educator, want to go into these conversations about transition. So you want to look at all those potential options, and you want to create mutual benefit. So that's really the kind of conversation about these two chapters, which I think are really important for you going forward, because they talk about important skills and softer skills that you need to develop as special educators. And they also talk about the practice of really being in touch with employers, looking carefully, observing carefully, asking questions, having conversations, so that the different kinds of tasks that go into a day on the job can be understood and can be managed for the benefit of your student. The other strand that we're looking at, of course, is transition. And what I'm having you develop this week is some thoughts about independent living. Independent living obviously has to do with whether or not a student or a person can be out on their own. So I've selected an inventory that focuses on parental input, but really can give you some insight into what your student can do, and in terms of living independently. And what I liked about this particular inventory was that it established so many different domains for you to look at. So I'm asking you to select a couple of those domains. They could have to do with grocery shopping. They could have to do with transportation. They could have to do with cooking and following recipes and being able to do basic housekeeping skills also. So in conversations with your student this week, think about asking about one of those domains. Find out if your student feels comfortable doing these sorts of things, and begin to think about and develop in the transition plans some idea of how your student can function independently in the community and be on their own. So I think that's it. Thank you so much for being with me. Thank you so much for continuing on this journey. I love exploring this stuff. I hope you're finding it as practical and as important as I do, because it's also really teaching me a lot about how job development and the idea of negotiation can reach out into and be transferable into other kinds of situations and circumstances that you're going to find your way into as a teacher, and knowing what lies ahead for your student in transition, and not just stopping at graduation and not worrying anymore, really setting up a future plan that seems to be able to work with all these different variables included is a real important skill and set of skills for you to develop. So thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to talking to you later in the week on Friday. Have good weeks until then, and enjoy your students in the meantime. Learn a lot, keep thinking. You're doing an excellent job. Thank you.